Suddenly there was a stir among my fellow travelers, who had been standing about with pale, frightened faces, helplessly debating. Again we heard the hoarsely shouted commands. We were driven with blows into the immediate anteroom of the bath. There we assembled around an SS man who waited until we had all arrived. Then he said, "I will give you 2 minutes and I shall time you by my watch. In these 2 minutes you will get fully undressed and drop everything on the floor where you are standing. You will take nothing with you except your shoes, your belt or suspenders, and possibly a truss. I am starting to count. Now." With unthinkable haste, people tore off their clothes. As the time grew shorter, they became increasingly nervous and pulled clumsily at their underwear, belts and shoelaces. Then we heard the first sounds of whipping, leather straps beating down on naked bodies. Next, we were herded into another room to be shaved. Not only our heads were shorn, but not a hair was left on our entire bodies. Then on to the showers, where we lined up again. We hardly recognized each other, but with great relief some people noted that real water dripped from the sprays. While we were waiting for the shower, our nakedness was brought home to us. We really had nothing now except our bare bodies, even minus hair. All we possessed, literally, was our naked existence. What else remained for us as a material link with our former lives? For me, there were my glasses and my belt. The latter I had to exchange later on for a piece of bread. In the evening, the senior prisoner in charge of our hut welcomed us with a speech in which he gave us his word of honor that he would hang, personally, from that beam, he pointed to it, any person who had sown money or precious stones into his truss. Proudly he explained that as a senior inhabitant, the camp laws entitled him to do so. Where our shoes were concerned, matters were not so simple. Although we were supposed to keep them, those who had fairly decent pairs had to give them up after all, and were given in exchange shoes that did not fit. In for real trouble were those prisoners who had followed the apparently well-meant advice given in the anteroom of the senior prisoners and had shortened their jackboots by cutting the tops off, then smearing soap on the cut edges to hide the sabotage. Suddenly there was a stir among my fellow travelers, who had been standing about with pale, frightened faces, helplessly debating. Thus the illusions some of us still held were destroyed one by one, and then, quite unexpectedly, most of us were overcome by a grim sense of humor. We knew that we had nothing to lose except our so ridiculously naked lives. When the showers started to run, we all tried very hard to make fun, both about ourselves and about each other. After all, real water did flow from the sprays. Real water did flow from the sprays. Real water did flow from the sprays. Most of us were overcome by a grim sense of humor. After all, real water did flow from the sprays. The reaction of a man to his admission to a concentration camp also represents an abnormal state of mind, but judged objectively it is a normal and, as will be shown later, typical reaction to the given circumstances. These reactions, as I have described them, began to change in a few days. The prisoner passed from the first to the second phase, the phase of relative apathy, in which he achieved a kind of emotional death. Apart from the already described reactions, the newly arrived prisoner experienced the tortures of other most painful emotions, all of which he tried to deaden. First of all, there was his boundless longing for his home and his family. This often could become so acute that he felt himself consumed by longing. Then there was disgust with all the ugliness which surrounded him, even in its mere external forms. Most of the prisoners were given a uniform of rags which would have made a scarecrow elegant by comparison. Between the huts in the camp lay pure filth, and the more one worked to clear it away, the more one had to come in contact with it. It was a favorite practice to detail a new arrival to a work group whose job was to clean the latrines and remove the sewage. If, as usually happened, some of the excrement splashed into his face during its transport over bumpy fields, any sign of disgust by the prisoner or any attempt to wipe off the filth would only be punished with a blow from a capo. And thus the mortification of normal reactions was hastened. At first the prisoner looked away if he saw the punishment parades of another group. He could not bear to see fellow prisoners marched up and down for hours in the mire, their movements directed by blows. Days or weeks later, things changed. Early in the morning, when it was still dark, the prisoner stood in front of the gate with his detachment, ready to march. He heard a scream and saw how a comrade was knocked down, pulled to his feet again, and knocked down once more. And why? He was feverish, but had reported to sickbay at an improper time. He was being punished for this irregular attempt to be relieved of his duties. But the prisoner who had passed into the second state of his psychological reactions did not avert his eyes any more. By then his feelings were blunted, and he watched unmoved. Another example. He stood unmoved while a 12-year-old boy was carried in who had been forced to stand at attention for hours in the snow. His toes had become frostbitten, and the doctor on duty picked off the black gangrenous stumps with tweezers, one by one. Disgust, horror, and pity are emotions that our spectator could not really feel anymore.
Disgust, horror, and pity are emotions that our spectator could not really feel anymore. The sufferers,
The dying and the dead
became such commonplace sights to him after a few weeks of camp life that they could not move him anymore.
Apathy, the blunting of the emotions and the feeling that one could not care anymore, were the symptoms arising during the second stage of the prisoner's psychological reactions, and which eventually made him insensitive to daily and hourly beatings. By means of this insensibility, the prisoner soon surrounded himself with a very necessary protective shell. Beatings occurred on the slightest provocation, sometimes for no reason at all. For example, bread was rationed out at our work site and we had to line up for it. Once the man behind me stood off a little to one side, and that lack of symmetry displeased the SS guard. I did not know what was going on in the line behind me, nor in the mind of the SS guard, but suddenly I received 2 sharp blows on my head. Only then did I spot the guard at my side who was using his stick. At such a moment, it is not the physical pain which hurts the most, and this applies to adults as much as to punished children. It is the mental agony caused by the injustice, the unreasonableness of it all. It is the mental agony caused by the injustice. Strangely enough, a blow which does not even find its mark can, under certain circumstances, hurt more than one that finds its mark. Once I was standing on a railway track in a snowstorm. In spite of the weather, our party had to keep on working. I worked quite hard at mending the track with gravel, since that was the only way to keep warm. For only one moment I paused to get my breath and to lean on my shovel. Unfortunately, the guard turned around just then and thought I was loafing. The pain he caused me was not from any insults or any blows. That guard did not think it worth his while to say anything, not even a swear word, to the ragged, emaciated figure standing before him, which probably reminded him only vaguely of a human form. Instead, he playfully picked up a stone and threw it at me. That, to me, seemed the way to attract the attention of a beast, to call a domestic animal back to its job, a creature with which you have so little in common that you do not even punish it. The most painful part of beatings is the insult which they imply. At one time we had to carry some long, heavy girders over icy tracks. If one man slipped, he endangered not only himself but all the others who carried the same girder. An old friend of mine had a congenitally dislocated hip. He was glad to be capable of working in spite of it, since the physically disabled were almost certainly sent to death when a selection took place. He limped over the track with an especially heavy girder and seemed about to fall and drag the others with him. As yet, I was not carrying a girder, so I jumped to his assistance without stopping to think. I was immediately hit on the back, rudely reprimanded, and ordered to return to my place. A few minutes previously, the same guard who struck me had told us deprecatingly that we, pigs, lacked the spirit of comradeship.
I was immediately hit on the back, rudely reprimanded, and ordered to return to my place. A few minutes previously, the same guard who struck me had told us deprecatingly that we, pigs,
lacked the spirit of comradeship.
I noticed that he wore lovely warm gloves in that bitter cold. For a time he watched me silently. I felt that trouble was brewing, for in front of me lay the mound of earth which showed exactly how much I had dug. Then he began. "You pig, I have been watching you the whole time. I'll teach you to work yet. Wait till you dig dirt with your teeth, you'll die like an animal. You pig, I have been watching you the whole time. I'll teach you to work yet. Wait till you dig dirt with your teeth, you'll die like an animal. In 2 days, I'll finish you off. You've never done a stroke of work in your life. What were you, swine? A businessman?" I was past caring. But I had to take his threat of killing me seriously, so I straightened up and looked him directly in the eye. "I was a doctor, a specialist." "What? A doctor? I bet you got a lot of money out of people." As it happens, I did most of my work for no money at all in clinics for the poor. But now I had said too much. He threw himself on me and knocked me down, shouting like a madman. I can no longer remember what he shouted. I want to show with this apparently trivial story that there are moments when indignation can rouse even a seemingly hardened prisoner. Indignation not about cruelty or pain, but about the insult connected with it. That there are moments when indignation can rouse even a seemingly hardened prisoner.
Indignation not about
cruelty or pain, but about the insult connected with it. Fortunately, the capo in my working party was obligated to me. He had taken a liking to me because I listened to his love stories and matrimonial troubles, which he poured out during the long marches to our work site. After that, he was grateful, and this had already been of value to me. On several previous occasions, he had reserved a place for me next to him in one of the first 5 rows of our detachment, which usually consisted of 280 men. That favor was important. We had to line up early in the morning while it was still dark. Everybody was afraid of being late and of having to stand in the back rows. If men were required for an unpleasant and disliked job, the senior capo appeared and usually collected the men he needed from the back rows. These men had to march away to another, especially dreaded kind of work under the command of strange guards. However, as long as my capo felt the need of pouring out his heart, this could not happen to me. I had a guaranteed place of honor next to him. But there was another advantage too. Like nearly all the camp inmates, I was suffering from edema. My legs were so swollen and the skin on them so tightly stretched that I could barely bend my knees. I had to leave my shoes unlaced in order to make them fit my swollen feet. There would not have been space for socks, even if I had had any. So my partly bare feet were always wet, and my shoes always full of snow.
So my partly bare feet were always wet, my shoes always full of snow.
This, of course, caused frostbite and chilblains. Every single step became real torture. Every single step became real torture. Over and again, men slipped, and those following behind stumbled on top of them. Then the column would stop for a moment, but not for long. One of the guards soon took action and worked over the men with the butt of his rifle to make them get up quickly. The more to the front of the column you were, the less often you were disturbed by having to stop, and then to make up for lost time by running on your painful feet. I was very happy to be the personally appointed physician to His Honor the Capo, and to march in the first row at an even pace. As an additional payment for my services, I could be sure that as long as soup was being dealt out at lunchtime at our work site, he would, when my turn came, dip the ladle right to the bottom of the vat and fish out a few peas. This capo, a former army officer, even had the courage to whisper to the foreman, whom I had quarreled with, that he knew me to be an unusually good worker. That didn't help matters, but he nevertheless managed to save my life, one of the many times I was to be saved. A few minutes previously, the same guard who struck me had told us deprecatingly that
lacked the spirit of comradeship.
I was very happy to be the personally appointed physician to His Honor the Capo.
Never managed to save my life,
One of the many times I was to be saved. Apathy, the main symptom of the second phase, was a necessary mechanism of self-defense. Reality dimmed, and all efforts and all emotions were centered on one task: preserving one's own life and that of the other fellow.
Reality dimmed, and all efforts and all emotions were centered on one task: preserving one's own life and that of the other fellow.
It was typical to hear the prisoners, while they were being herded back to camp from their work sites in the evening, sigh with relief and say, "Well, another day is over. Well, another day is over. Another day is over. Another day is over. Another day is over. It can be readily understood that such a state of strain, coupled with the constant necessity of concentrating on the task of staying alive, forced the prisoner's inner life down to a primitive level. Several of my colleagues in camp who were trained in psychoanalysis often spoke of a regression in the camp inmate, a retreat to a more primitive form of mental life. His wishes and desires became obvious in his dreams. What did the prisoner dream about most frequently? What did the prisoner dream about most frequently? Of bread, cake, cigarettes, and nice warm baths. The lack of having these simple desires satisfied led him to seek wish fulfillment in dreams. Whether these dreams did any good is another matter. The dreamer had to wake from them to the reality of camp life and to the terrible contrast between that and his dream illusions. I shall never forget how I was roused one night by the groans of a fellow prisoner who threw himself about in his sleep, obviously having a horrible nightmare. Since I had always been especially sorry for people who suffered from fearful dreams or deliria, I wanted to wake the poor man. Suddenly I drew back the hand which was ready to shake him, frightened at the thing I was about to do. At that moment, I became intensely conscious of the fact that no dream, no matter how horrible, could be as bad as the reality of the camp which surrounded us and to which I was about to recall him.
At that moment, I became intensely conscious of the fact that no dream, no matter how horrible,
No matter how horrible, could be as bad as the reality of the camp which surrounded us.
no matter
Which I was
how
about to recall then.
could be as bad as the reality of the camp which surrounded us, and to which I was about to recall him.
Because of the high degree of undernourishment which the prisoners suffered, it was natural that the desire for food was the major primitive instinct around which mental life centered. Let us observe the majority of prisoners when they happened to work near each other and were, for once, not closely watched. They would immediately start discussing food. One fellow would ask another working next to him in the ditch what his favorite dishes were. Then they would exchange recipes and plan the menu for the day when they would have a reunion, the day in the distant future when they would be liberated and returned home. They would go on and on, picturing it all in detail, until suddenly a warning was passed down the trench, usually in the form of a special password or number. The guard is coming. I always regarded the discussions about food as dangerous. Is it not wrong to provoke the organism with such detailed and effective pictures of delicacies when it has somehow managed to adapt itself to extremely small rations and low calories? Though it may afford momentary psychological relief, it is an illusion which, physiologically, surely must not be without danger. During the later part of our imprisonment, the daily ration consisted of very watery soup given out once daily, and the usual small bread ration. In addition to that, there was the so-called extra allowance, consisting of 3/4 of an ounce of margarine, or of a slice of poor quality sausage, or of a little piece of cheese, or a bit of synthetic honey, or a spoonful of watery jam, varying daily. In calories, this diet was absolutely inadequate, especially taking into consideration our heavy manual work and our constant exposure to the cold in inadequate clothing. The sick who were under special care, that is, those who were allowed to lie in the huts instead of leaving the camp for work, were even worse off.
The sick who were under special care, that is, those who were allowed to lie in the huts instead of leaving the camp for work, were even worse off.
When the last layers of subcutaneous fat had vanished, and we looked like skeletons disguised with skin and rags, we could watch our bodies beginning to devour themselves. The organism digested its own protein, and the muscles disappeared. Then the body had no powers of resistance left. One after another, the members of the little community in our hut died. Each of us could calculate with fair accuracy whose turn would be next, and when his own would come. After many observations, we knew the symptoms well, which made the correctness of our prognoses quite certain. He won't last long, or this is the next one, we whispered to each other. And when, during our daily search for lice, we saw our own naked bodies in the evening, we thought alike, this body here, my body, is really a corpse already.
This body here, my body, is really a corpse already.
What has become of me? I am but a small portion of a great mass of human flesh, of a mass behind barbed wire, crowded into a few earthen huts, a mass of which daily a certain portion...
When the last layers of subcutaneous fat had vanished, and we looked like skeletons disguised with skin and rags, we could watch our bodies beginning to devour themselves. The organism digested its own protein, and the muscles disappeared. We could watch our bodies beginning to devour themselves. And when, during our daily search for lice, we saw our own naked bodies in the evening, we thought alike. This body here, my body, we saw our own naked bodies in the evening, we thought alike. Mind's body is really a mind already. Is really a... What has become of me?
I am but a
small portion of a great mass of human flesh, of a mass behind barbed wire, crowded into a few earthen huts, a mass of which daily a certain portion begins to rot, because it has
become lifeless, come lifeless, come lifeless, come
because
lifeless.
it has become lifeless.